I'm IFC's Director and Global Head for Climate Business. I'm an IFC veteran, 24 years, done many things. And I am a big believer, even when I ran Asia and green buildings, because green buildings are what I call very often the unsung hero of climate or the climate challenge. And the reason they're so important is that if you look at it today, as economic growth continues, the COVID pandemic notwithstanding, a lot of pressure is going to be put on urban centers. The number that I have is between now and 2050, another 2 billion people may migrate to urban centers. And that's where the jobs are being created, because in the previous century, jobs were created largely in manufacturing. So you could have manufacturing hubs outside cities. But today, either new cities are going to be created, and a number of, and Egypt is a great example of the new capital, but pressures are going to keep mounting on existing cities. So the question is, how do we build these cities in a far more efficient manner and minimize the carbon footprint? So IFC, we developed our own tool called Edge, which is a green building tool, which I think is now being used more and more in Egypt and many other parts of the world. And the reason that we had to develop this tool is we found that LEED and other models and other tools were more catering to the global north. But most emerging markets are hot, so you needed a slightly different tool to do that. So we're very proud of that. Last year, we greened almost over 17 million square meters of space. We've also developed a tool called Apex, which is for cities. How do you assess the carbon footprint and the impact in cities? And then how do you solve for it? But very important, as is in our panel, is how do you make these cities and green buildings more resilient to climate risks? If anyone was thinking climate risk is not happening, it's happening for real. Floods are for real, typhoons are for real, and droughts are for real. And for cities, we've seen the horrible pictures coming out of Pakistan, out of Nigeria, where houses were getting flooded, businesses have been destroyed, and livelihoods have been destroyed. So that's really a critical component. And with us today, we've got a great panel. Let me start on the extreme right. We've got Robert from the IOE. He's replacing his boss, Roberto. We've got Helucia Schmidt, who's the sustainability manager at Bechtel. We've got Amra Elhami, who is with the Egyptian Sovereign Wealth Fund, looking after a sub-fund for real estate, tourism, and antiquities. And on his left, we've got Hisham Al-Khazamdar, who may not remember me, but I worked with him when he was at EFG, when we were doing our first deal with EFG in 2000 November. I still remember that very well. That's when I used to live in Cairo, by the way. So I think we're going to break this panel up into two parts. One is a more general discussion. Sorry, I forgot. Scott Sarver. Sorry, I thought I'd introduce you. Sorry. Who's the principal with RATI or ratio. My apologies. Thank you, Noha. So we try and break the panel up into two parts, and then we'll be open for questions. First is really the importance of creating an environment which encourages sustainable development of cities, and we also need very often FDI for that. And everyone's got a role to play. It's going to be governments, the public sector, the private sector, MDBs, DFIs, investors, lenders. It's not just for one, because the importance of policies, blended finance in many cases, how do we de-risk for some of the more risky or not so viable parts today? So that's critical, really. Let me start with you, Amra. Can you explain how the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which was really recently established, how do you plan to leverage private sector partnerships to increase your presence and to really get the sector kick-started there?
Hello. Yes. Okay, so let me start with the investment process and how we source the investors to start with. So basically, the investment process that we adopt includes extensive studies post-offering to the private sector that include technical studies, highest and best use, and also sustainability studies, so that when we offer that to private sector partners, we highlight what level of sustainability are we targeting with those investments. And there is a clear example with the Tahrir complex building that we had discovered that the original architect 70 years ago had been adopting sustainability. So it would have been a shame that we wouldn't, during the repurposing and adaptive use approach, that we don't adopt sustainability. So basically, with this building, and that's an interesting story, we discovered that the building was heading towards the north with an arc shape to capture all the cool air, and it had various courtyards to make that air circulation, getting the hot air outside. Also, the courtyards were not of the same size, and this was phenomenal because the original architect made that as a sun clock to make sure that as the sun goes away from the building, the courtyard gets bigger to capture more sunlight, hence doing power saving into the illumination of the building. So again, answering your question, we focus on making sure that we put to the market investable products that are sustainable. That should mean eventually lower OPEX during operating years, good environmental incentives, and also access to financing at reasonable terms. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Amra. I did not want to make a plug for our green buildings tool, but you've actually done that, because what green buildings is effectively is a slightly higher upfront cost, but it reduces your operating expenses because it's about lower energy consumption, optimizing water, and better managing your waste. And when you talked about the courtyard, I'm reminded of something which I wish we can scale up. There's an architect, and I forget his name, who's actually constructing buildings even in the US. And they're constructing them in a manner that if it's a hot climate, it minimizes the way the windows are done, that it minimizes the heat inside. And in cooler climate, it maximizes that. So it actually reduces energy purely by design by almost 15 to 20%. And then you've also seen now there are reflective paints that have come out. And if you coat your house or a building with that reflective paint, it automatically reduces the temperature by about 2 degrees in Celsius. So a lot of interesting things happening. And I think I like what you said is how do we maximize and get more private capital to come into the space. Hiloshia, you come from a large construction company. What would be interesting to hear from you is when you're looking at the space, what are the challenges and opportunities that you all at Bechtel are seeing?
Um, Thank you. Yeah, we come from a slightly different perspective, and for those of you who don't know a lot about Bechtel, we're a pretty diversified company. So we build large energy projects in the oil and gas space, infrastructure projects, airports, railways, motorways. We look at mining and metals projects. We build nuclear projects, renewables, a lot of the infrastructure that's really going to support the energy transition. But when I think about our role and our challenges, we really are the implementation arm of how these projects get built. So when we look at new technology, financing for our customers is still a little bit of a challenge, but we can facilitate the implementation of technology that gets us to green buildings, to cleaner technologies. But when we look at implementation of a sustainable approach to projects, we look at it from a pretty broad ESG lens, one that looks at the planning stages as an opportunity, not just for implementation of technology, so a twin approach where you're looking at how do you implement technology that's in the R&D stage into actual execution. And when I talk about technology, I'm not just talking about maybe what you heard a lot about in this conference, which is carbon capture, hydrogen, but also alternative materials of construction. So you're talking about concrete for large construction projects. You're talking about steel, but even are there other materials outside of concrete that are applicable to a particular use? But then more broadly, when we approach a project, we look at what other opportunities there are locally. So from a supply chain perspective, how do we enhance the local supply chain? How do we look at our suppliers differently? And then from a economic development perspective, which I really think is important as we look at the city's approach, is how do we enhance the skills needed, not just for our projects, but that can be transferable to future projects in terms of the energy transition. So we've successfully been able to implement large apprenticeship programs, training programs that really kind of enhance opportunities for workers as they move from one current project to a future project as well. So I wanted to bring kind of the social planning as well as the technology implementation. So we see that as our role, but we see our role as bringing together the supply chain that contributes not only the technology, but the embodied carbon of the facilities, the financial institutions, but also the social aspects, the license to build, the license to operate, the economic development that we think we have a responsibility to bring to the region as well.
So thanks very much, Alicia. So you touched upon 3 points, and I'm going to make a point of it, Iman, to you, because we talked about it in the carbon session as well. I think we're all missing out on the importance of skills because, I was giving a talk on digital a few years ago when I ran Asia for the IFC, and we looked at the top 10 companies in the Dow, and only one of them existed more than 30 years ago. So 9 of the top 10 companies did not exist 30 years before that. And the only one that was there was JP Morgan, actually. So I suspect the same thing is going to happen now. Is 30 years from now, as you have low carbon pathways, new technologies, I think you're going to have a very different set of companies. And the question for governments is, are you investing enough in skilling for things like green building investors, for things like what we talked about previously, carbon, uh, you know, shipping, seafarers, they need to be reskilled. Almost everybody needs to be reskilled, or you need a different set of skills. So I think that's going to be very important. I think you mentioned technology, and there let me make a plug for what we're doing at IFC is really how do we link carbon markets to new technologies, because new technologies need blended finance. So the question is, how do we de-risk that cost initially? And then last but not least, we're shortly going to come out with a report on green buildings and the whole value chain. But what is really interesting is today you're having things like you can replace, they tell me, I haven't seen it, I've seen it in one building in Washington, a house actually, where instead of concrete and cement or steel, you can actually have something made of biomass, which is equally tensile and equally strong. So very interesting things, and that means you can have also carbon offsets coming in there. So clearly a lot happening, but we need standardization, I would argue. Isham, let me come to you. You manage other people's money effectively. They want a high return, I guess. So how do you then balance the need for giving your investors a return that they want, but making sure that you're doing things the right way in a more sustainable manner?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It turns out that the trade-off is not that hard to make, at least nowadays, and as far as particular industries are concerned. So when it comes to green buildings in particular, the way we think of it, you make buildings greener, depending on how the carbon footprint of the materials that go into these buildings, depending on the types of energy and their carbon footprints that will go and supply those buildings. And third, depending on the energy efficiency of these buildings themselves. And we're not real estate developers, so we haven't tried to generate returns that way. But we're investors in utilities, and we're investors in industrials and building materials. And across these, we've identified opportunities where we could do well and at the same time have a positive impact. So when we take the 3 elements that we talked about, in terms of supply of energy to buildings, through our company Taka, we've been large investors in renewables in Egypt, starting with the Bin Ben projects and subsequently a number of private-to-private projects. So supplying, inputting as part of the grid an element of renewables in addition to conventional power, conventional fuels generating power. And we've been heavily involved in the construction of natural gas pipeline connecting households, around 1.5 million households over the course of the past few years, replacing essentially the traditional butane LPG tanks with natural gas methane piped to homes directly, which is cheaper as far as government and as far as consumers is concerned, and a lot lighter, about 30% lighter in terms of emissions, in terms of heating, cooking in these homes. So that's in terms of energy source. The other large project that we've invested in has been Egypt's first insulation materials company, a company called Glass Rocks, which we established 7 years ago in the El Sadat industrial area, producing insulation materials. And historically in Egypt, buildings have been built with zero insulation. Where people, electricity was cheap, winters are mild, and in the summer, people put on their ACs, and electricity was cheap. Electricity is not cheap anymore, and people are becoming more aware of the need to insulate their homes. So we produce rock wool, glass wool from locally available raw materials, basalt, silica sands, the challenge there is the shift that needs to happen on the regulatory side and in terms of mindset and usage. So, building codes in Egypt don't require insulation of homes up to this point. With the new capital being built, insulation was part of the specs for the new capital. But this is really the government's, the developers of the new capital taking that initiative and wanting to build buildings up to the highest standards. But a lot of the real estate development that happens around the country still doesn't have insulation mandated as part of it. Which brings me to the point of what needs to be done in a country like Egypt and in other developed economies to have more green buildings. So again, I think to your question, the issue is not the economics. It makes sense to replace butane tanks with natural gas piping. It makes sense to insulate homes. It makes today solar is competitive. Solar and wind are competitive, if not cheaper, relative to conventional source of powers. So the economics are there, right? We no longer need to make the case for the economics. What we need, particularly on the regulatory side, is three things. On the one hand, in some aspects, more stringent regulations when it comes, for instance, to insulation requirements, making it a requirement, not an option for people to insulate their homes. And I know this is self-serving given that we produce the materials, but happy for the materials to be bought from others as long as the homes are insulated and more energy efficient. So more stringency in this respect. As far as renewables consumption is concerned, I think a key bottleneck in Egypt is going to be greater visibility on wheeling fees and wheeling charges. So up till now, Egypt has introduced a wheeling system. That's a great development. But that wheeling system, up till now, fixes fees for only up to 1 year, making it very hard to do long-term contracts with whether homeowners or industrial users, as far as private to private or wheeling through the grid deals. So longer visibility, predictability as far as wheeling will enhance additional investment in renewables and additional offtake of renewables for consumers. And then the third element is greater flexibility as far as some aspects of building codes are concerned. So Egypt is a country where building codes are very heavy on concrete and steel usage. And that goes back to a history in the 17 and 80s of some shoddy buildings and buildings falling down. So there was a rationale for these very strict building codes. But we need now to introduce more flexibility to allow for new, more innovative building materials that would be lighter in terms of their carbon footprints and as reliable as concrete and steel, but introduce that element of flexibility, allow for innovation as far as building materials are concerned. And then the money will come from us and from others. Thank you.
Thank you, Hisham. I couldn't agree more with you that you really need sometimes regulatory changes. I would also add, I think a great opportunity actually is we're always looking at new builds, but to go buy a whole lot of brown buildings, retrofit them, make them green, and I can assure you you'll get a good return. We've been trying to do that, and it's now picking up because, in our countries, because the embedded carbon footprint that you have in existing buildings is high. So both the carbon cost and the dollar cost of tearing them down and building new construction is a lot more. So I think we need to look at more at retrofitting. And I also wanted to mention that things like insulation are going to play a big role, and we really need to do a much better job at getting the word out that these are, I wouldn't say small things, but incremental, which can actually significantly impact, when look at it in a cumulative way, the carbon footprint. Robert, let me go to you now. We talked about skilling, but we'd be interested to hear from you and how your organization, the IOE, and other organizations are partnering both with the government and the private sector to see how we can really get the skills needed when, especially comes to green buildings.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. And just to set the stage a little bit, I wanted to play a very short video to show an interesting example from a developing economy, if you allow. It is one of our business heroes, this time from India, focusing on green construction materials.
Built environment is responsible for more than 45% of global carbon dioxide emissions. These emissions come from the construction material and the space conditioning requirements. In 2019, we founded Green Jams to create a beautiful carbon neutral built environment. Today, we employ more than 40 people across our factory locations and the headquarters. Going green does not mean you're going to be expensive, but you're going green basically means that you're going to be sustainable on the long term. And that's basically where true sustainability of finances come into picture. Climate impact directly affects our production cycles. The hotter it gets, it's very difficult for us to workers to manufacture the blocks. The colder it gets, it's very difficult for us the workers to manufacture the blocks, as well as the amount of production that we're able to do. The curing time increases for our construction blocks, which basically means that we're able to supply the blocks at a much lower pace. Rains have also a huge impact. It practically makes the workers inaccessible to our factory locations. It damages some of the raw materials that we store, and most importantly, even the construction halts during these periods of time. Now, the more adverse the impact of climate change is, the more it's going to be difficult for us to make sure the operations are managed. Now, because of this, what has happened is that seasonality has become part of the business model, and we have accounted for that in our tradition, in our daily cycles in that sense. There are festivities that have been always happening, because of which some of our supply chain is disrupted. But then I think this is another externality which is becoming normal in terms of operations. Climate change is making a lot of difference in terms of what we're doing, in terms of production, in terms of how we deliver the customer satisfaction, and even at the time of construction. I think if we don't bring this under control, and as we take concrete measures to reduce this, it's going to become significantly a big challenge in the longer term.
Thank you for the patience. And yeah, I think a lot of good things were said already. Just to give a little bit of background, I came across some interesting statistics, that illustrate the growth of this sector in the U.S. market. According to a recent study I was reading, in the U.S., the green construction sector was worth around $3 billion total in 2005, whereas by 2010, in 5 years, it went up to between 43 and 54 billion. On the other hand, between 2000 and 2008, around 1 million workers were involved in this sector, and between 2009 and 2013, it went up to 3.3 million. So I think we can all agree here, this is a very fast-growing sector. There's a lot of opportunity, and I totally agree that the skills issue is central to this. For us, we believe that in order to avoid significant skills gaps and mismatches and slow down this impressive opportunity, we need to collaborate, we need to work together, we need to create partnerships with educational institutions, private sector, government. We need to work on things like apprenticeships and technical and vocational training. And then through that, we can enable some of these things, green construction principles and efficiencies. Energy efficiency obviously is a big element of all of this, and I feel like there's already a lot of progress there in different regions. But I think some of the elements for success were already brought up, and to us it's about, first of all, standards. Standards are very important, making standards that make sense and that can work for the industry. Second of all, the skills area. Third of all, the design. You have to start from the design stage, right? I was watching a news report recently, which looked at, for example, cement and concrete. It's very hard to recycle. Sometimes you put a coating over it, which makes it basically impossible to recycle. But if you use a different type of coating, then you can reuse the same material. Same for steel, for example. Most steel today is done with welding. If you replace welding with bolts, you can achieve the same result, but the construction can be taken apart and the materials can be reused. So with some of these, like we say, the devil is in the details when we look at the design, when we look at the standards. And then the last part I wanted to bring up is accreditation and certification of educational and training programs. We have to look at the nuances, we have to look at the details, we have to analyze the local markets and contexts and put in place frameworks that can work for everybody. And in this way, we can reach resilient and adaptive design. And I think, as we've heard from the video, as we know in Egypt, resiliency and adaptation are a big part of all of this. I'm going to stop here for now. I think we're all on the same page here, and thank you for the discussion.
So I have to say, this is turning out to be a bit of a boring discussion because everyone's agreeing with everybody else. But couldn't agree more with you, Robert. What's important is that we're able to adapt regulations and policies when it comes to things like to local context, because otherwise you have a tendency to say, this worked really well in this part of the world, that's now replicated. And I'm saying we have to adapt it. And I think that's what I'd also love to get connected to this company in India because I'm going there week after next. And this is really a passion of mine, on the hard-to-abate sectors. Scott, let me come to you. Now, from an international design firm perspective, what do you think is needed for us to really leapfrog in this space?
Well, actually, I'm working with Amr and the fund on the renovation of the Mogama building in central Cairo. Hello? Okay. So I'm working with the fund on the renovation of the Mogama building in central Cairo. And while I've heard so many things and all technologies and everything, and the thing that has been sort of interesting to me is the aspect of time and what can we do today and what can be impactful. So with these properties, when we started with the fund, this was Tahrir Square. It was the center of Cairo. And the fund was controlling this 14-story, very large historical former government center, as well as an NDP site located on the river. So most fundamentally, the opportunity, the efficiency of the opportunity to regenerate the core of the city, support density in the center of the core where the infrastructure is there, hopefully regenerate. I believe those buildings might be 25% occupied. Tremendous amount of square feet down there. Sort of create a genesis of reuse and save the carbon of that new construction, if that new building would be constructed. So I believe at a most basic level, this regeneration of the center of the city and allowing that to emanate out to the existing building stock, existing infrastructure, start with what you got rather than building new. And the second part of it, as Amr had mentioned, the building is foundationally very sustainable. It has very shallow spans. We're converting the building to a sort of lifestyle hotel. It's very shallow spans. It has light wells for daylighting. It has this sort of hugging embrace facing north to the public square that'll continue to be used in a way of gathering. We will be replacing all the mechanical systems with sort of state-of-the-art energy efficient systems, insulating the building, even though we're not required to, new high performance windows, etc., which will, in addition to those aspects, because the building is in a dense urban area, it's served by public transit. It's a very walkable community. It's not that difficult for us to achieve a LEED Platinum rating, and because of the stairs and the atriums that were alongside the stairs, we're also pursuing a WELL certification to promote the use of those stairs. So this building, built in the 1950s, will be back brand new with the highest levels of sustainability. Other aspects of that I think are worth noting is it really requires a consistent commitment among among developers, financial groups, owners, operators, architects, engineers, to really have that optimistic path at the very onset of the project, and that becomes a real driver. And then, you know, the last thing to note for us working in Egypt and our clients who are also from the USA is this model of the public-private partnership, sort of walking hand in hand together. You know, it takes a lot of risk off the table because we share those risks. And that does allow us to be more aggressive toward our goals of sustainability and those issues, because we share the values and we're holding hands and going there together. Or perhaps jumping out of an airplane with one parachute, we have to hold on to each other.
Yeah, so thanks, Scott. Actually, you preempted my next round of questions. But so what we heard in the first round was really a high-level discussion on what is needed. But I think it's important to be able to translate that into what does it really mean on the ground. And I think the work being done by y'all, Amr, and all of y'all on the panel on Tahrir Square and converting it into Cairo House, I think is important. And my memories of, I think the hotel has changed. There used to be the Nile Hilton at one end, and then you could walk to the coffee house, I think Groppi at the other end. And I think it's important that we really can showcase what can be done at a practical level, not only from a very important from a sustainability perspective, but equally important, I would say, from a heritage perspective. So, Amra, let me go to you. Can you explain to us a little bit about this project and the role that you are playing here?
Okay, so at the beginning, there was a huge debate between whether to tear down that building and come up with a new structure, and what this entails in terms of not protecting our heritage. Because basically this building is documenting an era. It's the transformation between the Khedivial period into the new republic. So no, we and I thank Ayman for supporting that. We fought so much to make sure that we preserve the building, despite the fact that it's extremely challenging, that adaptive use exercise, in light of that the building had very low payloads to host new MEP components, was very restrictive. The absence of a basement to host the back of the house were challenging, but we weighed the risk. And we made sure that, again, putting that offering to the existing landscape of Cairo and developing a sustainable development in terms of not demolishing the building and what this entails in terms of producing waste and, of course, emissions during that demolition approach, all came up with a very unique proposition that can be a good addition to the landscape of the hospitality in Cairo. We're doing a design lifestyle 4 to 4.5 star hotel. Again, we believe that this is going to be complementing the 11,000 hotel rooms in that area that are non-experiential. So again, I think us adopting sustainability led us to preserve the building, which led to being matchmaked with Oxford and global, the private sector developers, that will yield into a unique addition to the landscape of properties in that area. Thank you.
So thanks, Amra. I think, Scott, the next question is for you, but it's been partially answered. But I would add to that. So one is, what were the decisions that went into, which I think Amra has partially answered, in demolishing the building and constructing a new one? But, can you share some of the practical challenges that you're going to face in something like this?
Well, it's absolutely chock full of practical challenges, but in the big picture, there's a significant difference in the carbon footprint of reusing. I'm hoping it can be a demonstration project for the area. I'm hoping it will have that synergistic effect from all the buildings around it, and really, turn this place at the center of the city that's had a difficult time in the past into a new face for the city and a really regenerator, and it's alongside with the museum, the Arab League, the new NDP project. So, one of the things that happened to us in Chicago a long time ago is the whole city burned down. But you know what? That was a great opportunity because we got to build a new city the right way. So with the government moving out, evacuating these sites, that presents an opportunity to really make these things happen in concert with us and regenerate the core, which, because the infrastructure is there, the transit is there, the roadways are there, all the things that come with new buildings somewhere else are required. In addition to the carbon issues of the building is the infrastructure to access the building. So it's kind of a model that, quite frankly, can work in. We've seen it work in Chicago with Millennium Park. You can see projects like the High Line in New York. A small investment, but it's created a dramatic impact, brings density. Density is shared services, shared infrastructure, which it's all more effective in terms of carbon in the environment.
Just a quick reaction. So I want to congratulate the Sovereign Fund of Egypt for the regeneration of the Mugamma building and the plans for Cairo House. We live in a country that has so much ancient history that there's sometimes a reflex not to value more recent heritage, and a reflex to either tear down to build new, or simply leave things to fall apart and go develop something new. And I think this model, and inshallah it will be a great success, is exactly the kind of model that a city like Cairo, with so much 19th century and 20th century important architectural heritage needs. Well, again, I'm biased. I live in Garden City, which is another early 20th century Belle Epoque neighborhood adjacent to Tahrir and to the Mugamma. So as a citizen, as an individual, I'm cheering that effort because its success, again, will inform, I hope, a lot of other similar experiences that can be done around downtown Cairo, let alone old Islamic and medieval Cairo.
Thank you, Shem. Actually, it's an approach, and we've been transferred to a number of properties within that area, and we made sure to diversify the use to somehow demonstrate to the private sector or other partners that this can be an area of potential. So basically what we're doing with the ministry, the former Ministry of Interior complex, is that we're building that ecosystem that includes an educational project that we believe is going to be somehow resilient and defensive, and building around that university an ecosystem that has offices, co-working space, a 3-star hospitality offering. We've signed the developer, the partner developer has signed last week an MOU with Marriott on a Moxie 3-star hotel to be catering to the university students as a hostel facility, and also catering to the backpacking tourism type of business that was not catered to before. The third property we're doing into that area is the former National Democratic Party land plot, and we're doing there, again, another experiential hospitality offering and branded residence. Thank you.
So I think just to, again, congratulate you all, Ayman and Amra, for doing this, because I think it does 3 things. One is you reduce, and in no particular order of importance. One is you reduce the carbon footprint. Second is you retain your heritage. And, I've got a young daughter who's about to turn 13. And for her, everything is a great glitzy building, beautiful, well lit. And I don't know what the carbon footprint is, but all glass. And for the kids of today, that's what's important. They've forgotten our heritage. And last but not least is why I do personally hope that will ultimately lead to an economic revival of Tahrir Square, because my grandfather used to tell me he's gone there when he visited Egypt, I don't know, 70 years ago. So I think that's really important, and be able to actually demonstrate that heritage, sustainability, and economics come together. I think this is going to be a fantastic demonstration project, and I'd love for you to come to my country, India, and tell them to do the same in Mumbai, Bombay, and Delhi, possibly. So, Isha, I'm coming back to you. Again, you look at multiple projects. How would you prioritize what you look for in a project? And I suspect you've got a limited pot of money, so you have to make choices. So can you take us through some of the thinking that goes into that?
Sure. And I want to start with your last point around limited pockets of money and sources of financing. You know, I think one of the key incentives nowadays for private sector investors like us to prioritize projects that have a net positive impact as far as climate and environment is concerned is how much sources of financing, and in particular concessionary sources of financing, have become linked to SDGs and ticking the right boxes as far as climate is concerned. So, you know, one of the largest projects that we had that we developed historically was a refinery, and it was a project that took us a long time to execute. And argue, you know, as far as refineries can be green, and they can never be green, but this is a project that reduced emissions because it substituted imports with local production at Euro 5 at much higher environmental standards. But if we were to try to finance the same project today, we wouldn't be able to do so. Okay? Simply the door for certain types of projects that are hydrocarbon heavy or that simply don't tick the right boxes as far as SDG, climate, environmental impact objectives are concerned, you're simply not going to be able to get the financing for those anymore. So that's naturally, you know, there's a self-selection accordingly. You know, you want to find, again, opportunities that make fundamentally economic sense, and that you're going to be able to finance the most optimal way possible. And nowadays, financing the most optimal way possible very often converges with making sure that from an ESG point of view, you're doing exactly what you need to be doing.
Well, I mean, sorry, let me try and put you on the spot, Hisham, if you don't mind. Are your investors willing to live with a slightly lower economic return for a higher impact?
The honest answer is no. But the case that I'm trying to make is I don't think, you know, look at renewables, for example. 10 years ago, you had to make a case to invest in renewables. You know, you had to have a set of impact investors that would accept lower returns in return for investing in green energy. You don't need to make that trade-off anymore. You know, the prices of PV panels, the prices of wind turbines, you know, the scaling of these industries has led to a point where the economics are there, you know, where you can produce power as cheaply, if not cheaper in some circumstances, vis-a-vis conventional power by using renewables. So it's a much easier argument to make vis-a-vis investors, vis-a-vis funders today. Again, I can't generalize. This doesn't necessarily apply to all sectors. It doesn't necessarily apply to all green opportunities, but there is certainly a big enough subset out there where the stars are aligned, you know, where you can be doing the right thing and generating appropriate returns for your investors.
Thanks, Hisham. That was quite a convincing, because we get asked this at the IFC all the time. Are you willing to prioritize dollar returns for higher impact? And there is a convergence, and it's becoming even more and more relevant now. Hello, can we go to you? You know, Bechtel is a global company. You all see projects all over the world. You see standards. You know, when you see differing standards, how do you try and reconcile some of that and adapt to different markets?
No, thank you for the question, because I did want to build up upon some of the points that were made. There are obviously challenges, and a lot of our approach to sustainability is contextual, depending on where we are. But with that, for large projects in particular, an implementation of new technology, and specifically alternative materials of construction, which apply to the building sector a lot, the reverse perhaps of maybe some of the points that were made on the cold is also true in terms of being able to implement new cementitious materials, as an example, as part of concrete, because they're not approved by a code or an international standard. And we actually have representatives at Bechtel that participate in different code committees that actually try to work to have some into being able to approve those. Beyond that, there are codes from a resiliency perspective that have requirements related to wind speeds and earthquakes and other kind of challenges from a code standard or regulatory perspective that can be restrictive. So that's not a unique thing. I think to Egypt is something that's challenged throughout the world. But in terms of beyond just the implementation of technology and getting through those items, I think one of the things that we focus on that I think is critical in all this is the early planning and the partnership with our customers, understanding from a technology perspective what's coming next, what some barriers might be in terms of implementation of the technology. From a skill set perspective or workforce perspective, we've tailored programs depending on the location that might include partnering with community colleges, as an example, to develop curriculum and programs for just-in-time training that we can use and look not just during the construction of the project, but beyond construction into transfer to operations, but also transferability of skills that are more broadly good for the worker that is actually developing an economy. So our approach is not one size fits all. I like to say that shiny new things that happen when the project is in execution are not very easily incorporated, and they typically result in cost and schedule overruns, which are not good for anybody. Shiny new things need to be looked at very early on in partnership with everybody, with your technology provider, with your customer, with the financial institution. And the good sustainability program is devised at an early stage and executed. Because I'll put another spin to carbon. A project that is executed on time and on schedule and is planned to reduce waste, water, energy is absolutely going to be lower carbon because you haven't extended that schedule. I'm not going to get into kind of the construction piece on that, but that's part of it that we consider as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's really useful because at the end of the day, you're talking about transferability of skills, but also what is very important when you're executing a project is that you complete it on time because there are financial implications in addition to the carbon implications in that. Robert, let me come to you now. Can you give us a few examples of green construction where your organization was involved, where public-private partnerships played a key role, and what's your view on that in general?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm going to be straight with you. We're not a sectoral organization. We're based on the global level. So all of you here have much more experience and involvement directly in the construction and building sector than the IOE. On the other hand, we see our role as facilitative and as a network, and we try to engage with different partners across the world and also work with our members on national level, like the Federation of Egyptian Industries. One thing that we engage in heavily is the International Labour Organization as one of the official constituents there. The ILO does a lot of sectoral work where they develop international standards, guidance, tools, things like that. There has been some work in the construction sector there already. On the other hand, we also are very closely involved in the Just Transition agenda, which I also think has a role to play in the construction sector. For example, some of these just energy transition partnerships that have been launched, like the one in Indonesia, I think has a relevance in this context. So yeah, on the global level, we try to work with different partners and connect them to our members. The skills agenda again is very important for us. And I think, at places like COP, you can really see the opportunity of collaboration and partnerships. At another panel I was in that we organized last week, we had the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We found out that they do a lot of very good work with international partners, some of our members as well, on skills on just transition. We have this morning signed a letter of intent with the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development and the Federation of Egyptian Industries to collaborate on skills frameworks and trainings for workers, especially youth and women in Egypt. And we plan to scale this up to other countries with other members. We're also working closely with the ILO and some of their big initiatives. They launched recently the Green Jobs for Youth Pact, where they commit to train millions of people in different regions with partners like LinkedIn, for example, who are revamping their whole platform to have a green dimension. Other companies like Adecco as well. So it's hard for me to comment directly on this specific sector. But what we try to do is, bring up the importance of sectors like this one, and then connect our members, our employers, organizations who then have the expertise on local level and can bring, on the one hand, some of these training and educational programs. On the other hand, enable some of the regulations and policy enabling frameworks we need. And third of all, bring to light some projects on the local level like the ones we've heard of today.
Sure. Thank you so much, Robert. So with that, I think we're coming towards the end, and I'd like to open it up to the audience if they have any questions or comments or thoughts to share. Okay, going once. Yeah.
Hello, Shem. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the very, very insightful discussion. And I would want to reflect on the discussion going on from two dimensions, actually. The presence of the Sovereign Wealth Fund as Egypt's new spearhead for structures that is totally innovative is very interesting to see happening now in Tahrir building and rolling out in different sectors. But I would want to ask Hisham here about what you see from your viewpoint with this vast experience of the stumbling blocks that's facing Egypt to take this very disruption that's happening on the structural and investment level to the next level, opening the funnel to the huge potentials out there through PPP structures. What is it that you would see, you want to, break through and find it happening in the coming very short time?
Thank you. That's a very tough question, and it's a particularly tough question to answer in a politically correct manner. But let me have a go at it. I think. Listen, I think the good news is when we look at an Egyptian context, I think we've fulfilled a lot of the prerequisites, right? A few years ago, there was no way we could have attracted any meaningful FDI, whether in a PPP context or whether in a private-to-private context, without seriously revamping our infrastructure. Okay? So that was a prerequisite that needed to be dealt with, and I think that was dealt with very efficiently, whether on the power generation side, whether on the road infrastructure side, whether on the ports infrastructure side, and a set of other things that people perhaps pay less attention to. So that's box number one. Okay. Box number two had to do with regulatory overhauls. Okay. And again, I think whether it's companies law, bankruptcy law, new labor law, there is a set of updated legislation that has been passed in recent years. I think the challenge there is more to go. We still have a whole set of issues where the legislative framework dates back to the 70s and 80s and needs upgrading. And in some cases where even with new legislation, the implementation of that legislation, executive regulations, actual applicability, these new laws trickling down to not the minister level or his deputy, but several layers down to the person working in some government authority. So that I think that remains. So a lot of work has been done there, but more remains to be done. On the macro side, in particular, with this most recent flotation of the pound. I think there was a lot of money holding back, waiting, for a more competitive and a freer exchange rate. And I think the combination of these things has translated into the quantum of signatures and deals that we've seen announced here at COP, with the Sovereign Fund of Egypt playing a role in and I like your word, spearheading, and in some cases structuring some of these deals, whether they're investing in them as they are in some of them, or even when they're not, but really bringing the parties together for these deals to come through. I think, in short, I think I'm optimistic that we now have the building blocks to enable significantly heightened levels of FDI in the coming period. The challenge, as always, is going to be execution. For Amr and Ayman and Abdullah and their colleagues to keep on pushing, for the governments to keep moving forward with respect to reforms, including on the legislative red tape side. And I think, but the good news is a lot of the hard work, a lot of the tough building blocks that had to be put in place have been put in place over the past few years, and we need to recognize that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hisham, for that comprehensive answer. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, with that, let me try and conclude what we've heard today. So I think clearly the importance of upskilling or reskilling, the importance of regulations and being adapt your policies or new innovations in different environments is critical. The role that technology is going to play, and technology coupled with innovation, whether it's insulation, whether it's new kinds of steel or decarbonized steel and cement, or using biomass as construction materials, using bolts instead of welding. So these are simple things which can be done. Very important, I would like to add the need for blended finance, because a lot of these sectors may take time before they're fully commercially viable, and solar is the best example of that. Yeah. So and therefore I'll come to my last point, is the need for demonstration projects to be successful. And there's one person who in this room has been living this, which is Helmi, who's sitting right at the back, who actually was doing some fantastic work when I met him first in the early 2000s. But his company has been living sustainability for what, I think 40 years now, or they've been living that. And I'm really glad to see today that this has come of age and this is now being mainstreamed. But therefore, I think it's important that we have these demonstration projects which can demonstrate to the world that investors can make money, we can decarbonize and do it in a sustainable manner. And very important that we don't leave people at the bottom of the pyramid out on this journey to decarbonize and therefore skilling. So with that, let me thank all our panelists for a great panel discussion. I know we've done a bit early, but we missed out on one panelist. But sometimes I think if you can get the message across in a shorter period of time, nothing like it. So please join me in giving a big round of applause to our panel.
Yes.